Daddy's Little Learner. Chapter 18. Facing the Music. Kevin lived on his own, apart from a black Labrador called Fish, in a little cottage a couple of miles from the Santa Pod Raceway, which is a famous drag racing venue. Tina, one of the prostitutes who had been in the flat the first night I met Brian, came up too, and would all go to the drag racing together, mixing and drinking with people who had travelled from all over the country to spend their weekends up there in tents. It was exciting to be part of their community amongst the good-natured motor enthusiasts, hanging out in the ear-shattering roar of the cars and the fog of exhaust fumes. I was hugely relieved to have got away from the aggression and danger of the streets in King's Cross to a place of relative safety. Here we could relax and breathe again and be more ourselves. We had only been away from Norwich for 6 weeks, but it was long enough for my picture to have been published in the local papers, with a story explaining that I had disappeared and asking the public for any information they might have about my whereabouts. The information they put out about me wasn't exactly flattering. They said I was about 5 foot 6 inches tall, has short auburn hair, a slightly spotty complexion, and sometimes wears glasses. She is quite stocky and looks older than 15. The description fulfilled all my worst fears about myself. Dad's words rang in my ears. You're fat and ugly, and no one but me will ever love you. But Brian did love me, of that I was sure, and that was the best feeling I had ever experienced. Although we frequently had no money at all during those weeks, we weren't completely reliant on my earnings because Brian had his benefits. They just weren't nearly enough to support us and our various drug and alcohol habits. Once a fortnight during the time we were in London, Brian had hitchhiked back to Norwich to sign on the dole and get his money, which meant I was on my own for 2 or 3 days while he waited for the money to come through. I never liked it when he was away, feeling vulnerable and lost, but I knew he had to go. He did the same from Northampton, but this time the police were waiting for him at the dole office, and he was arrested when he got there. They grabbed him and demanded to know where he had hidden me. Tina phoned from Norwich to tell me what had happened, and I knew the game was up. I was really upset that just when I was beginning to feel settled, it all went wrong again. Realising I needed a friend, Tina travelled back to Northampton to fetch me and dick the shit. I wanted to come back to Norwich myself in order to explain to the authorities that Brian was completely innocent, that far from abducting me, he had actually been helping me to escape from Dad, who was the real villain of the story. Tina was still living at the flat in Norwich, so once we got back to the city, she took over looking after Dick, and I surrendered myself to the social services. The social workers knew pretty much everything there was to know about me by then. They knew about me being on the game, and they all knew that Dad had abused me, even though they hadn't yet got round to pressing charges against him. Now they had Brian in their clutches. They finally seemed to think they had enough to go on. Both he and Dad were charged with living off my immoral earnings. My world came crashing round my ears. This was the last thing I ever wanted to happen. It tore me in two when I had to go into court to give evidence against Dad. I stood in the witness box for about an hour and a half, with him staring long and hard at me, and there were so many emotions flooding through me. I hated him and loved him at the same time. I was pleased that people now believed me and that he was finally going to pay for what he'd done to me over the years, but I also felt guilty that I was betraying him and ensuring that he went back to prison yet again. To make me feel 1,000 times worse, my grandmother was waiting for me outside the courtroom, screaming abuse at me, telling me what a liar and a bitch I was for saying these things about her precious son, Terry, not caring who heard her ranting or what they thought of us. "How can you do this to my son?" she yelled. "To your own father! He would never do those things to you. Why are you telling all these lies?" The court disagreed with her. They didn't think I was a liar. They believed every word of it. Dad was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years. The judge made a point of saying it was the maximum sentence he could give for the offence, as he knew the whole story and wanted to reflect the public revulsion at how Dad had behaved towards me over the years. The fact that he was my father and that I was underage made Dad's crimes all the more repellent and unacceptable to everyone who heard about them, including other prisoners he was likely to meet once he was inside. Child abusers don't get treated well in places like prison. I heard later that he was taken to one of the special units, where they put nonces and the rapists and other sex offenders for their own protection. I used to hear sometimes of the things that other inmates do to sex offenders, like giving them humiliating haircuts or uniforms that don't fit with trousers halfway up their ankles. They would put bits of glass in their food and chuck slops down onto their landing so they would get covered in it. I have to admit there was a part of me that liked the idea that other people were taking revenge on my behalf, sticking up for me, confirming that what Dad had done to me was wrong, just as I had always believed it was. Such humiliation would be even worse for someone who was as vain and pleased with himself as Dad was. He liked to be admired by those around him, not despised. At the same time, I feared for him and his tendency to depression. Even in my moments of vindication, part of me still felt guilty and worried about what I'd done to him. I knew that a lot of men ended up driven to suicide when they found themselves in positions like his, and Dad had shown many times that he was capable of such acts of self-destruction when he was low. Having to give evidence in court against Brian, the man I loved and who had proved in so many ways that he loved me, was even harder. They tried to convict him for abducting me, but I stuck up for him so vehemently they couldn't make that charge stick. Being an inherently honest man, however, he couldn't deny that he'd had sex with me, or that he had shared the money I earned in London in order to eat. So he was given 6 months for having sex with a minor and for living off my immoral earnings. It all came as a bit of a shock to Brian, who hadn't really thought he was doing anything wrong. I suspect he had grown so used to treating me like I was the same age as him and the rest of his friends that he'd pretty much forgotten I was officially still a child during our time together. He even talked about suing the police for wrongful arrest before the gravity of his situation was explained to him clearly by his lawyers. It was obvious that the courts had to be seen to do something about what had happened, but any attempt by the prosecution to make Brian seem like a paedophile rang very hollow. He was indisputably my boyfriend, and even though I was underage, I had been sleeping with men for money for over 2 years by then, so I was hardly your average innocent little schoolgirl. What he had done was more of a technical misdemeanour than a great moral crime. The length of his sentence, compared to the one handed down to Dad, showed that the judge did not view their crimes in the same light, but that he couldn't turn a blind eye completely to what Brian had done. The judge made it clear that I had consented to the sex with Brian, which I had never done with Dad, and the newspaper coverage of the case reflected that sympathetically. However, I still felt guilty about the catastrophic effect I had had on his life, and I missed him terribly. Like Dad, when he went into prison, Brian was offered the sort of protection that paedophiles and sex offenders can have. But he categorically refused to accept it. He wanted to be treated like every other prisoner because he wasn't ashamed of anything he had done. Everyone in the prison would have known the story by the time he got there and would have known about Dad. Like me, they would have seen Brian more as a hero for trying to get me away from Dad than as a villain of the story. No one gave him any trouble, and he settled into prison life as philosophically as he settled into everything else. Brian was such a sweet-natured man. He never once blamed me for his predicament, just shrugged and got on with serving his time, looking forward to our future together once he was out and once I was old enough to live with him openly. In the meantime, the authorities had to think what to do with me, and I was sent back to Bramerton. I was heartbroken they had taken Brian away because he had such a calming influence on me, and at that age a 6-month sentence seemed like a lifetime. But at least now I believed I could envisage a future for myself, a future with him. I'm sure the authorities thought our great love affair would peter out while we were apart, but there would be no chance someone with my past record would wait 6 months for any man. But they were wrong. For the first time in my life, I had someone who cared about me, someone who was willing to put his neck on the block and go to prison for me, and I wasn't about to throw that away. As the months passed, and they saw that we were still writing to one another all the time, and that I wasn't going to go off with other men, the staff at Bramerton began to realise that we weren't going to be so easily separated, and they allowed me to go visit him in prison. It wasn't depressing or frightening like visiting Dad had been all those years before when Terry and I were kids. It was lovely to see him, even though we had to have a social worker sitting with us all through the visit. He was still his same easygoing self, just accepting the way things were without bitterness and saying nice things to me, making me feel special. The prison governor and Mrs. Macquarie at Bramerton used to talk to one another on the phone, and between them they came to the conclusion that Brian actually might be quite good for me. He was the opposite of Dad in every way, always advising me not to run away from Bramerton and not to go on the game, assuring me we were going to get married and be all right as soon as he had served his time and I was old enough. They started to find ways of letting us talk to one another on the phone. The governor would arrange to get Brian into his office and would ring Mrs. Macquarie, who would then call me into her office and hand me the phone. Despite Brian's calming words, however, it wasn't long before I was escaping again. The habit was just too deeply ingrained in me to stop. Most of the time I didn't even know why I did it, any more than I knew why I smoked cigarettes, took drugs or drank. Maybe it was a challenge each time because Bramerton wasn't that easy to get out of. There was only one lane in and out, so I couldn't use that if I wanted to run away, as it would be the first place they would go looking. So I always had to start out across the fields, hiding behind the hedges and trees, which was bloody hard work. I would start out quite fast, pumped up with adrenaline, but I soon got tired and I wished I'd never bothered. It reminded me of the horrors of cross-country running, which Wimbledon College used to make us do, which used to nearly kill me. On one of these escapes, I finally staggered out onto the main road at a point I thought would be safe at about 9 at night. Having picked off the various bits of hedge and kicked the worst of the mud from my boots, I stuck my thumb out for a lift into Norwich. It wasn't long before a car drew up, and the smart-looking man at the wheel said he would take me. I climbed in gratefully. "What are you doing out at this time of night?" he asked as we drove off. "I've just been round my friend's house to do my homework," I told him. "I've missed my last bus home, and my dad's going to kill me if I'm late." Don't worry, he said. We'll get you there nice and safe. You don't have to worry about anything. I'm a policeman. I didn't know if blood actually can run cold, but it certainly felt like mine did at that moment. I was sure I was about to be driven straight back to Bremerton. Trying not to show my shock, I kept the presents going, hoping I might be able to bluff my way through. He was very friendly and tried asking me a few questions, which I lied my way out of quite easily. "Where are your books for homework, then?" he asked after a while. "Oh, you know what they're like," I said airily. "All those bloody textbooks. My friend gets a lift in with her parents, so she's taken mine in for me to save me carrying them." "You're not one of those runaways from Bremerton, are you?" he joked at one stage. "Excuse me?" I hoped I wasn't blushing. "What's Bremerton?" "Haven't you heard of it?" he laughed. "The big children's home over the fields." "Ah, what sort of people go there then?" I asked, and he rabbited happily on for the rest of the journey. I guess he thought I was much older than I was, and dismissed the idea of me being a Bremerton girl as ridiculous. He dropped me off in time without showing the slightest flicker of suspicion, and then drove off to the police station to start his next shift, probably feeling pleased with himself for being such a chivalrous knight of the road. I later heard that when he got there, he looked at the log to see what was going on, and only then realised who I must be. When I was eventually picked up and taken back, the staff at Bremerton told me how furious he was. "God help you if you ever meet him again," they laughed. "He was really mad." Even though I carried on running away from Bremerton while Brian and Dad were both in jail, I always stayed completely faithful to Brian, waiting for him to come out so we could start our lives together properly. I used to get drunk and high a lot in order to try to forget how lost and lonely and confused I felt, but I stayed off the game. A lot of the boys at Bremerton tried to chat me up, and I used to play pool with them and everything, but I was never tempted to stray. They were just mates. I was in love with a grown-up man. With Dad out of the way, Kathy really wanted to help and agreed to have me stay with her so that I could get out of care for a bit and try to adapt to a normal everyday life. She's such a sweet woman, and she gave me a nice room of my own in her house on the condition that I behaved and got in by a certain time every night. I wanted to please her, but I was back to socialising with a lot of the working girls I had known when I was on the streets, and I would go to the same pubs as them, the Brown Derby, most nights, even running my own slate there. My drinking was getting way out of control, and one night I drank 14 pints of snakebite, a mixture of cider and lager, in the space of a few hours. There was one particular hooker they called Sally, a great big scary looking woman who'd recently had her nose pierced. I was terrified of her, but I was never going to let her know that. "I'd like to do that," I said, tapping the side of my nose. "I'll do it for you," she offered. There was no backing down now. I had to let her know I was as tough as her, or I would never hear the end of it. "Sure," I said bravely, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Come on then." We wove our way to the ladies' toilet, and she jabbed a stud into my nose, pushing it straight through. It really, really hurt, but I wasn't going to let on. My eyes were streaming, but I held in the cries, just as I used to when Dad was beating me. He trained me well for situations like that. I kept the stud in, and amazingly, it never even went septic. In the end, Kathy couldn't take the worry of being responsible for me. She would try to reason with me every time I rolled in drunk and high in the early hours of the morning, and I would feel really remorseful about letting her down again once I'd sobered up. I would apologise and promise to be good, but then I would get bored or blue and I would be off again. I really wanted to please her, but it was as if I was on a direct course of self-destruction. I knew it wasn't fair to ask her to put up with me any longer, and I went back to Bramerton without making any fuss, knowing that it was now only a few more weeks before Brian would be out of prison and we could be together. By that stage, most of the staff at Bramerton were used to me and knew how to handle me. Sometimes, after I'd been on the run for a while, I would just give up and ring them and ask someone to come and get me. Once, after the pubs were closed, I was so drunk that I threw up all over the car that came to fetch me. I must have stretched their patience to the absolute limit, but they had pretty much given up trying to tell me what to do and what not to do, and they would laugh at me instead. "Why did you do that then?" they would ask every time I did something stupid. "When are you going to be going on the run again then?" They were endlessly patient because I was always letting them down. I would take whatever punishment they doled out for a few weeks, such as extra calls or withdrawn privileges. I'd earn their trust back and then throw it all away again, on a stupid whim. Maybe they just thought I was a lost cause.